Hello, everybody. My name is Dratnos, and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus for the week beginning on March 17th on the North American servers. This week's affixes are Fortified, Bolstering, Grievous, and the Awakened pattern is on the A pattern, so the same one that we had last week. This is a pretty rough week for doing high keys, doing keys where you're running up against the timer. Bolstering is going to slow you down, right? In some cases, it doesn't affect what you can pull, but in a lot of cases, it does. And even in the cases where it doesn't affect which packs you can pull safely, it really does affect how you can go about pulling them. You have to do your damage in a slightly different way in order to make sure you're not causing yourself a big bolstering problem, or you might just ignore it and then end up having to do a lot of extra damage over the course of the dungeon to get through all the extra health that you've added to mobs. So either way, slows things down. It's also a Fortified Grievous week, so there are a lot of pulls that get pretty hard with both those affixes active. And since it's a Grievous week, that's an affix that affects the boss fights, even though it's not a tyrannical week. So you don't get as free of a, breeze through the boss encounters as you get on some Fortified weeks. Okay, so let's get started going dungeon by dungeon. As always, we'll start with the Atal'Dazar, and also, as always, you can find my routes. I'll have a link in the description below, but they're on Radar.io every week. So Atal'Dazar, bolstering is really annoying with the Sorid pulls in the middle. The way that you generally want to handle this is like CC some Sky Screamers, kill a bunch of Sword packs, and then kill those Sky Screamers that you had CC'd at the same time. Depending on how good your group is at this, you can do this in fewer or more pulls. Like you could just approach each pull as like CC the Sky Screamer, kill the Swords, kill the Sky Screamer. Or you could do CC the Sky Screamer, kill these Swords, maybe even pull these Swords with these Swords, and then pull this Sky Screamer with these Sky Screamers, right? That kind of strategy. So the more you're able to do that, the less the bolstering is going to slow your route down, but either way, it is going to slow you down whenever you're pulling stuff in here. Bolstering also makes this middle pull almost impossible to do if you're actually wanting to kill these Swords with these three, because they'll bolster them 4 times, and that's really, really tough to deal with. You can actually fight the Swords separately from the 3 big mobs. They're not actually linked mobs, so if you can separate them with like a Ring of Peace or a crowd control on the Sword that leads the patrol of the Swords, it will separate from the other ones, but that takes quite a bit of time to set up. Kind of hard to put that into a route that's designed to be for everybody, so I didn't include that here. It's actually not a bad strategy, though, if you're interested. And then the other thing that's a problem in here is just Awakened is always really obnoxious, because you always need to, like, find a way. You're either going to fight this enemy with the last boss, which is my strategy for this week, or you have to, like, pull this pack to the side and vanish and then have your group go into the obelisk while you're doing that, or, somebody can sacrifice themselves, all those sorts of things. Really, Atal'Dazar are one of the ones that I imagine is actually fairly tough this week. Freehold's a pretty good bolstering dungeon because most of the enemies are about the same size. Really, the only things that'll cause bolstering problems are like if you fight one of these Irontide Crushers alongside a lot of small mobs. Even then, you can just focus damage on these things. They don't have like that much more health. They only have like twice as much health as the other things. Another weird thing to note is that these Bilge-Rat Brine Scales have a little bit less health than all the other mobs that you'll see in the packs with them, about half as much health. So that is another thing to watch out for. Usually they'll just die first anyways. There's not really much you can do to avoid it because you're just AoEing. But sometimes that's just something to keep track of. Often they should die first anyways because they have the most lethal abilities in the pack. Frostblast, one of the few trash abilities that can really wipe a group in here. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Just something interesting to note if you're wondering why those are always dying first. Freehold Eudora is an enemy this week, so that makes this boss fight not trivial, but it shouldn't be too bad because it's not tyrannical. And beyond that, my route here is a pretty common suggestion of fighting this spider here with the last boss. That works out pretty nicely because the last boss is so easy at the start of the fight while you're dealing with the spider. And then once you push the boss to the level where he actually starts affecting everybody with his abilities, the spider should be dead. So pretty natural fit there. But if you're worried about that, you can always just take this over here and kill these mobs and then go into the portal and get the spider that way beforehand. A little bit slower, though, so I don't recommend doing that if you're running up against the timer. King's Rest, one big thing to note is that minions of Zool will bolster, so you want to make sure that you get them before or after whatever you're going to pull here. So, sneak down here, Mass Spell, Arcane Torrent, these minions of Zool without pulling these guys, and then pull these guys with these guys is what I want to do this week. Another plan, you could pull these two first, and then you could deal with these, and then you could pull these two. That's slower, does it in more pulls, but it removes the problem of having to like deal with these without pulling these, which can be tough for some groups, for some compositions. But the big problem minions of Zool are these ones. So these ones, one way you can deal with them is like a rogue can stand here right where they spawn and get them as they spawn. They'll all spawn on the same spot, so if the rogue is just standing there and has Cloak of Shadows up, they can actually just kill all of these and then vanish and not get anybody else in combat. That can eliminate these without causing any damage. Otherwise, you have to be really careful. A common way for groups to wipe in here is they're fighting these mobs, and then these things come in and bolster these mobs a couple times, and it's all over. So really want to try and avoid that. Other than that, King's Rest fortified, you're mostly worried about same thing as you always are, Shadow of Zul, and then Grievous making the boss fights tough too. Shrine of the Storm historically is a pretty bad bolstering dungeon. So notably, these droplets don't bolster, but initiates do, Tide Sage initiates do. So for that reason, my route is a bit different here than you'll see on a lot of other weeks. Normally, I like to skip this section, but because these Dredge Sailors don't bolster, I don't think this area is too bad this week. Instead, I want to skip all this stuff. So this stuff is pretty good. There's a lot of good count in here, but it requires you to do a lot of finesse to avoid bad bolstering situations. Because these initiates will bolster Heldis if you don't know what you're doing here. They'll bolster Runecarver Sorin if you're choosing to pull that enemy, or these ones will come in at some point when you're fighting these things. All of those can be really bad. In a coordinated group, there are some good ways involving like snap spots or crowd control, DPS taunts, those sorts of strategies to avoid causing bad bolstering problems. But I've decided for this route to just say, all right, here's what the route would look like if you just skip this. Turns out the answer is you basically have to pull every other enemy in the rest of the dungeon, but it does work out. So that's my strategy for a group that doesn't want to have to think about how to not bolster this. Siege of Boralus Bolstering is a high-risk, high-reward affix in here because you can bolster an Ashvane Spotter, make it really big, and then it'll one-shot everything with its sighted artilleries, including all the stuff you want to kill. So a strategy that wanted to abuse that could be very effective this week in Siege, but you have to deal with a lot of logistical challenges. You have to make sure that nobody ever gets meleeed by that big spotter. You have to find a way to deal with the CC immune enemies that also don't get killed by the spotter. So Ashvane Commanders, for instance, do that. They're usually on horses. That can be really bad. So if you can solve those problems, this is a really good week to not use this route. And instead, you're going to want to skip like everything at the start of the dungeon, race over here, get to this spotter, bolster it up, and then use it to like kill all of the enemies in this quarter without needing to use any effort or much time. But, well, I mean, you do have to use a lot of effort to set all that up, but the main thing it saves you is time. Difficult to execute, though, so my strategy is a more accessible one that doesn't involve trying to do that. Temple of Sethraliss, fairly unimpacted by these affixes, not really much bolstering nonsense going on in here. Grievous is going to be tough on the boss fights, but it's fortified, so they should be reasonably quick. Even though actually the last boss fight, make sure your healer has full mana going into this boss fight, because that can be pretty rough otherwise. But otherwise, not too much to note from how the affixes impact this dungeon. Motherlode bolstering is a real pain. You gotta find ways. It's really easy to end up with a big bolstered Peacekeeper, which is a problem because Peacekeepers are mobs that you want to pull because they're very efficient count. They have, not all that much health for how much count they give, and that you also get the count from the mech jockey that piloted them, assuming you tagged that mech jockey. So it's really efficient count to kill Peacekeepers. That's why you'll usually see a lot of top groups pulling as many as they can. But this week, it's kind of tough to get access to these ones because all these little laborers are going to do a lot of bolstering. My route is going to try and avoid. I basically pulled as few laborers as possible. These three at the start, just get them out the way. This guy here, because it's tough to avoid. And then from there, we're just skipping all of the laborer pulls. What that means is we do have to pull a little bit extra here that you don't normally need to pull. And we're pulling a little bit extra, like in this area that you could potentially skip, like these guys. But otherwise, not too much needs to change this week. And that, I think this is still a pretty good way to go about this. If you're a more experienced group, you can do something, you can play for more Peacekeepers. There are ways to handle these laborers. You can even, if you can nuke these laborers down before the mech jockey pilots the Peacekeeper won't get bolstered, so that's a really good strategy if you have the on-demand burst DPS for that. But it's, I always worry about marking those pulls in my routes because I feel like that would be something that would wipe a lot of groups who tried it. So I've basically just removed them for that reason. In the Underrot this week, I'm showing off a route that involves not fighting Samrek with the last boss. Last week, I had a route that did fight Samrek with the last boss, which I continue to believe is very doable, but is very intimidating for a lot of groups. So I instead have a way to go and actually activate his obelisk and kill him before fighting the last boss. But really, if you can, like, this trash is just so slow and obnoxious. If you can fight this with the last boss, use last week's route for me instead. Although, yeah, there are some good modifications for bolstering throughout the dungeon from this week, so maybe synthesize the two. Again, fortified in this room, your main objective is going to be fight at most one Bloodswarmer and one Maggot at a time, and that way you can keep those abilities under control, so that's why I've got the pulls mapped out like this, but in practice, this room ends up being much more like based on adapting on the fly, based on where the mob's little patrols are. You can, get it pretty consistent, but in practice, your tank is often just going to have to do a little bit of figuring out what they can pull based on where everything is. So, this is going to fall apart as soon as you actually get in here a lot of the time. Bolstering can get out of hand pretty quickly in Tol Dagor if you're not careful. Making sure that you've pulled this parasite pack before the boss so it doesn't come in during the boss fight is a smart thing to do. And making sure that you're just aware of what small enemies you might accidentally pull to bolster other enemies is always a good idea. Neutrals aren't going to bolster the hostile enemies, but a lot of these hostile enemies will flee. So if you are fighting, a bunch of enemies here, one of them flees, it can run and aggro these two guys, for instance, bring them in at full health, bolster them up. That can get out of hand for you. So be really careful about fighting enemies that can flee and maybe save some damage or crowd control for the end of the pull rather than the start of the pull. Waycrest actually not too bad with bolstering ever since they made maggots not bolster a while ago now. That change is implemented. Very good change. The really only bolstering problem area is Jagged Hound pulls. So in the courtyard here and with the matron here, figure out a plan that's going to work for you for those. Usually a good plan here is somebody can sneak out and crowd control this witch, and then all the dogs can be fought over in this hallway here, and then you go and fight the witch maybe with these things as well. And then for this one, often a good strategy is a DPS player, a Havoc Demon Hunter, for instance, can run in, Blade Dance, get threat on everything. Then your tank can taunt Matron Brindle and run this way, run back towards the courtyard. You finish off these 3 dogs, and then your group goes and fights Matron Brindle. Those are some good strategies, some good ways to deal with this stuff. You can try and just do priority damage to Matron Brindle, but she has 10 times as much health as the dog, so it's very likely that they're going to die and bolster her, and that is often going to cause a wipe in a high enough key, so be careful of that. Have a plan for this. Junkyard, I believe Gunker is going to be... You're going to be able to go kill Gunker first in the North American servers next week, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't have that rotation fully down yet. This is just how I think it works. Depending on what server you're in, this may not work, though, and it's possible I could be wrong about North America, too. So if there's a hard mode enemy over Gunker at the start, you need to not do this route, and you'll need to instead take my route from, say, 2 weeks ago that started off on this side, and do that instead. No matter what, never fight under the hard mode enemy. That's just... It makes it unnecessarily hard. The reason I like this route, though, and the reason that I use this on most weeks when I think that it will work, is that it gets you really quick access to spark bots, and that continues to be really valuable this week. So spark bots, or shock bots rather, their damage scales with key level. So part of the reason that if you look at the top Raider IO rankings right now, so many of the top keys are junkyards, is that this is a huge DPS increase across your group. And if you use this route, on this very first pull, you're going to get access to 2 shock bots, and on the second pull, you're going to get access to these 2. And even a stealther could go and grab these, and then come back. So you could have 5 shock bots by the time that you're finishing up the second pull with this strategy. And that's a really powerful thing to do because the shock bots do just so much damage. But again, don't do this if there's a hard mode enemy flying above Gunker. Workshop, not too bad with bolstering. It does depend, some of these pulls can get sketchy. These enemies, for instance, often you'll kill them with their own rocket barrage, but if one enemy doesn't get hit by those, then it can get bolstered 5 times. That can be bad. So make sure that you're handling this carefully. Make sure that, if you're trying to kill them all with rocket barrage, you actually get all of them and not just a few of them. And then this area, this pull in particular can be spooky because the Junkyard dog here has 10 times as much health as the Living Wastes. So fighting the dogs separately from the Living Wastes, these two, it's possible pretty easily to not fight, Living Wastes with higher HP mobs. But with this pull, you're going to need to CC, or you're going to need to do priority damage, or you're just going to need to accept that some bolstering is going to happen, but that's usually the worst option. Thanks for watching This Week in Mythic Plus. Hope it helped. If it did, remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.